All right, I'm joined by Christian Pina of the Gambling Podcast here. We're going to do a little bit of a special edition Bang the Book radio segment for this UFC Fight Night 145 card. Once again, just a standalone segment, trying to do something here to make up for the fact that I was sick throughout the week and missed Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday's shows. So, Christian, how's it going today, man?
Good, buddy. I've been seeing the well wishes for you, and I'd like to add on to that, man. Getting sick sucks, and when it's prolonged by that and everything else, there's not the worst in the world. So can't say feel better enough, man, and hope you kind of get over this. It's absolutely brutal. This is the first spot you've done this week, right?
Well, I did Monday's show, and for those that listened on Monday, I think they were astonished to hear that I even got through the show. And then I said, I'm just sitting around. I'm like, man, I can't do this to my people. I got to do something on Friday. So did a Friday show here today, made my way through that, getting better day by day. But I got to say, man, thoughts and prayers to you out there getting 7 inches of snow out in Vegas.
It's insane. And again, I feel like I just by default talk about the weather when I first come on the show every single time, and it just gets worse and worse. It was literally in Summerlin, which is about 20 minutes north of the Las Vegas Strip. There was upwards of like 10 inches. I live more towards the south end of the Strip, and it was like a flurry, but it's been 30s at night, snowing overnight, and literally snowing in Vegas for 3 days straight. Today was the first day it hasn't snowed here in the past 3 days.
I'll tell you what, it's 40 degrees here and all of our windows are open. You would think it's 75 degrees here, but hey, we got to try and get all the germs and all that shit out of this house. So, all right, let's go ahead and talk about this UFC Fight Night 145 card. And as you and I were talking, Christian, and you did a phenomenal preview over at bangthebook.com, I encourage everyone to go check that out. This is the first time that UFC has been to the Czech Republic. So does that factor into the handicap at all for you?
Well, when you look at this, right, and for anyone that's kind of read the previews and stuff, there's a couple of things that repeat themselves in terms of themes of how I break down UFC fights. And number one, fight IQ is the most important thing that I put stock in. If you do not have a good fight IQ, I cannot get behind you, no matter the situation, with a guy like Luke Sanders and stuff like that. The other is, my propensity to basically blanket statement say never bet on the unknowns, and that's a little bit tough to do in a sport like UFC where it's built on variance, much like a game like baseball, even more than baseball, I would really say. Anything could happen at any given time. Now, we don't know what judging will be like when it comes to, the Czech Republic. I mean, when this card was announced, it was pretty obvious that Lucie Pudilova would be on the card. She's the only Czech Republic fighter on the roster. So from that from that standpoint, it made sense for her to be there, but it's just another unknown, and you do not know how judges are going to react. Now, when it comes to hometown fighters, obviously there's only that one fight out of whatever it is, 14 on the card. So hometown cooking, quote unquote, is not going to be that much of an issue. Maybe you stay away from that fight, just if that is something in the back of your mind, because specifically it is a women's fight. As I've talked about time and time again, women's fights have such a propensity to end up on judges' scorecards. That fight, I believe, is like minus 380 for the over 2.5 rounds. So, maybe instead of taking that fight, you put that in a parlay or an open parlay, you flat bet it or whatever the case may be. You just don't know what style Czech Republic judges, or if they're flying in, all that type of stuff from where they're coming from, different types of judges or whatever the case may be. You just don't know what style they prefer, whether it's activity, moving forward, scrambling, striking, all that type of stuff, depending on how the crowd is as well. If the crowd is completely empty and one shot is landed and the crowd explodes, that could influence judges. You don't know how the crowd, even on top of judging, is. So it's just one more thing to take into account. And if you want to be conservative with it, you can kind of, if you want to bet this card, maybe take stabs at, fights that are aligned closer to, the expected outcome of submission and inside the distance and knockouts, rather than the fights that are specifically, I would say predicated to going the distance, which there certainly are a few of those on this card.
Now, of course, we got a very quick turnaround for this fight card here with the time change. This is a very early start time for us in North America tomorrow. But one thing that we can do, because we're recording this on Friday afternoon as opposed to Thursday evening like we usually do, we can talk a little bit about two fights where fighters missed weight and what you do in that respect. How does that factor into your handicap when somebody becomes a catch weight bout and somebody's forfeited part of the purse already?
It's completely the type of way that they missed weight is the key to that statement. If somebody is missed weight, but they have tried to deplete themselves so much and they are just exhausted, obviously you want to, look to go against them. On the other hand, and this was a very profitable trend towards the end of 2018, fighters were just saying, screw it. I'm going to forfeit 20%. I'm going to make it up if I get the win, at least, the 10%, 15, maybe a fight of the night. And they just were taking that 20% off and not depleting their body. There were fighters, Michel Prazeres on this card comes to mind, that is, he was pretty much at the forefront of it. I believe he missed weight in like 4 straight fights, which is kind of the reason he's still fighting lower skill competition guys and not getting fights. The UFC and fans of the sport somewhat look at it as a slap in the face of the sport. It depends on the type of way that they miss weight and kind of how they look on the scale and everything like that is really the key, and not just a blanket statement of they missed weight. Because again, there was when the fighters that were doing it essentially on purpose or just had enough of it, they were, fighters that missed weight towards the end of 2018 were hitting at like 81% over the last 20 fights or whatever it was. It was crazy.
All right, so before we break down some of the fights, some of the specific fights here on this card, overall, we talked about last week's card on ESPN as being a very strong card, certainly much better than the pay-per-view card the previous week. How's this one setting up here? You think this is a pretty exciting card from a watchability standpoint or not really?
Truthfully, this card is probably going to be geared toward more the diehard UFC fan than the casual one. And I say that just because there's not a ton of finishing power on the card. Thiago Santos in the main event, of course, but there's a lot of flyweight belts. There's a lot of lower weight classes that obviously tend to lean themselves into point fighting, which kind of gets into the MMA nerds weeds a little bit of, guys like me that love that style. But the casual fan may not appreciate it. And there's certainly, various fights on this card that may have the boo birds out in the Czech Republic or have you changing the channel at home, which is, for someone like me who's mostly a round prop better, specifically, overs. I love this type of fight. The boring, the better to me. But the casual fan, there's not a ton of name power. There are some prospects up here that eventually the casual fan may know, but they're still making that rise throughout the UFC's ranks right now and kind of dealing with those trials and tribulations. I mean, when you look at the main card on down through the line, maybe outside of a Thiago Santos, a Stefan Struve, there's John Dodson. There's not a ton of name power on here. So definitely more for the diehards. I would say if you're looking for a repeat of the ESPN type of fireworks that we were treated to, this card may not be for you outside of the main event. But again, anything is possible in this sport.
Well, and of course, betting certainly makes things a lot more interesting no matter what. So we're going to talk about that here as we break down the main card. And let's start with that Santos main event here, taking on Blachowicz. And this one's essentially a coin flip.
Yep, but I'll pick a -110 each way here. And look, Blachowicz is a guy that seemingly is always sniffing around a title shot. He's always in the top 10, always in the top 5. But when he gets his, chance or he gets a main event, he's been kind of known to not be able to break through the, quote unquote glass ceiling of the UFC when the competition is at its best. That being said, I mean, he is on a huge fight win streak right now of 4 straight fights. And when you look at the other side, I mean, he's a very polished mixed martial artist. He doesn't do anything great. He does a lot of things very well. I mean, he's so diverse is really what it comes down to with Blachowicz. He's someone, he doesn't discriminate. Let's say that, fight wins via decision, knockout, submission, any way to beat somebody, he's done it. He just struggles when the competition gets, greater. And on the other hand, I mean, Thiago Santos is a casual UFC's dream, much like a guy like Francis Ngannou. Since he's come to this weight class, I mean, a perfect record. Granted, stylistically, he had some nice opponents to greet him in Eric Anders and Jimmy Manawa, because all those guys wanted to do, they're not very well-rounded. They're one-dimensional. They're strikers, and that's what Santos is. He's a pure striker and does it better than just about anyone in this division, certainly. And so it's when you talk about paths to victory here, it certainly makes some sense, because the winner of this match is probably going to take the winner of Jones on the next UFC pay-per-view card, which would, again, very likely be John Jones against Anthony Smith. So the winner of this fight is going on to bigger and better things. And time again, the issue with Blachowicz is he kind of falters here. Santos 2 for 2 knockouts in his last 2 at this, again, new weight class for him. So it's a very interesting dynamic. When you talk about paths to victory here, there's certainly more for Blachowicz. Again, I touched on this. Decisions. Santos has shown he's not really capable of that. Submissions, again, nope. He has one path to victory here. It's the knockout, but again, it's something when you count on. We went through this a little bit when we were talking about Bermudez, that Bermudez fight, the last card. what would happen if he wasn't able to get that submission? And in that case, he was. When someone's a one-trick pony, albeit different tricks of a guy like Bermudez and Santos, one being submissions, one being knockouts, you just, if you put money on that side, have to be very wary of what happens if that one trick isn't able to land. And to an even stronger degree, a guy like Francis Ngannou. So it's a really tough fight to call. There's more paths to victory. He's a more well-rounded fighter in Blachowicz than Santos. And again, both guys coming in on winning streaks, so both are in good form. It's lined appropriately, I think. Gun to my head, I would go with Blachowicz just because he's more well-rounded and has more paths to victory.
All right, so a similar line here for the Struve fight in the heavyweight division. Do you feel like that one sort of sets up the same way? Could you sound like a broken record about this one?
Literally the same exact thing could be applied here. The only thing that's different is Struve is coming in on a 3-fight losing streak. There's rumors that this could be his last fight inside the UFC. I mean, Struve is a guy that raw, God's gifted physical being should have probably been, a tale of what could have been, if that makes sense. And again, he's a guy that doesn't do anything great, but does a lot of things average to above average. And that's going to get you very far in the UFC. I really struggle with this. Again, the more well-rounded fighter, if you put these guys, if you give a grade to, strike it, you give a grade on down through the line, when you tally up the points at the end of the fight, at the end of how you would handicap a grade this, Struve is going to come out. But the guy is a walking, emergency room. He is riddled with injuries, potentially his last fight. These two fights are so many. There's so many things outside of how you would normally handicap a fight, because there's so many things going on specifically with Struve mentally that you just don't know. He is the more well-rounded fighter. And I think going out on his shield is something that is important to most UFC fighters. He could go all in and De Lima could catch him in there, but it's really a different version of the main event, effectively the same fight.
All right, so what about the rest of the main card here? I know that there are a couple of fights that kind of grab your attention a little bit more than the two headline bouts. So what are you looking at here on the main card, which can be seen on ESPN+?
Yeah, when you look down at this, I mean, again, not a ton of name value. I touched on the Pudilova and Carmouche minus 145. Pudilova, the UFC really kind of did her dirty here. They needed to get her on this card, right? She's the only Czech fighter on the roster, so she needed it. Well, they made her lose an additional 10 pounds, depleting herself. It's just not a great stylistic matchup for a girl like that they probably should have given her a little bit of an easier matchup if they wanted to accomplish what I believe they did want to accomplish. So it doesn't, I go back and forth on this, because when I first looked at this fight, I was really leaning toward the side of Carmouche. The thing is when you talk about a fight that is so minus 325, for over 2.5, pretty much the same thing for either fighter decision, you don't know how a Czech judge is going to score for it. You just don't. Brazil is notorious for it. Canada is. Could, in theory, Czech guys be even worse than that? Yeah, that's a possibility. So I think that really is kind of factored in that line a little bit, because from a strict handicapping the fight, if this fight was in anywhere else in the world, I think that Carmouche certainly has the edge here. It's just a little bit iffy on you don't know. And when a fight is so almost guaranteed to go to a decision, it makes for a little bit of an issue. So, I would take that minus 325, put it in an open parlay that we've talked about time and time again, and really move on with it, just because, again, I don't like betting on unknowns. Another fight just below that one, the Dodson and Peter Yan fight. Seeing a lot of love out there for Peter Yan, and I certainly get it. Dodson is, again, plus 255, over 2.5, minus 350. So another fight that's going to go to decision. You just don't know what style these judges are going to favor here. Yan is, at this stage of Dodson's career, just about better everywhere, just a literal better version of a guy like Dodson, who Dodson is a guy is effectively 5'5", but could dunk, is the type of athleticism that he's had. He's just, over the battles over the years, has really slowed down. And when, Dodson is a guy who has mastered the point fighting style. And when you're talking about unknown judges, that's a little bit of a red flag. It's going to come down to, typical judging when you're talking about point fighting. It's going to come down to who gets the best of the exchanges in the pocket when there's going to be a lot of lateral movement. This could be one of the most boring fights of the night when it comes to that. After that, I want to talk about this Magomed Ankalaev fight, because Ankalaev is a guy that is a Russian prospect, and as you know, Russians in this sport are, usually considered from a heritage and background the elite. Khabib Nurmagomedov, Habibulov, Ismagulov, anything that ends in LOV is usually favored by a pretty wide margin as they come up through the ranks in the UFC against other prospects. Their regional scene is just incredible, and the training that they get is simply second to none. And kind of how they're born and bred in this is kind of their new, boxing, and they're effectively training these guys at such a young age. Ankalaev was I believe like a minus 400, minus 500 fighter in his first fight against Paul Craig. He was soundly 30-26ing him pillar to post, and what I would call the worst beat I have ever seen inside a UFC cage outside of Darren Elkins against Mirsad Bektic. With less than a second left, he went in for effectively just, I don't even know what it was, and got caught in a triangle. And literally as time expired, they was replays to see if it was, because the fight was so one-dimensional and so one-decided that if there was a fraction of a second between his hand hitting and the bell going off, the fight would have been awarded to Ankalaev. Things, you could say that that's a fluke, and he for sure kind of made those thoughts come true in his next fight, and showing that was probably just a fluke. And when we talked about guys like Habibulov last week and stuff like that, those are certainly red flags, and you have to be able to see what is just true variance and what is a red flag. And to me, the way he followed up his next fight is certainly proof that he is on the upward swing here. And a guy like De Abreu is certainly an up-and-coming Brazilian jiu-jitsu prospect, has some of the best jiu-jitsu probably for his age. He is coming in on a little bit of a short notice. He's 14-2 with 14 straight finishes here. And so there's, Ankalaev, both of his fights have been finishes, but again, probably should have been decision one if you're really great and clean across the board. So I think that this one may not be, the over 1.5 at minus 125. I lean back and forth because on one hand, this could be a firefight of jiu-jitsu, chain wrestling, which would obviously lend itself to the over. But when you're, in that transition, there's body parts flying everywhere. There's certainly, you can be caught very easy. And so gun to my head, I would probably take a stab at the underdog price there, just because I think that this fight, I think that Abreu is not getting necessarily the credit that he should. It's just, again, more of a value play than I think a full bet, if you will, much like going against Bermudez last week. But that one makes some sense in the undercard as well. Again, not a ton out there in the betting market for this one. I would say Michel Prazeres at minus 440. Look, the Brazilian tractor is going to do what he does. Again, if you're still wondering why all he does is get wins and the UFC refuses to give him better names, it's because he refuses to make weight. He grinds out decisions. I was a little bit surprised to see the over only at over 1.5 minus 140. I mean, he has been a decision machine throughout his career, so that one certainly probably has some value if Prazeres tries to take it safe with this newcomer, which certainly has him overpowered and overmatched. But again, I don't know how much he truly cares, because I don't think he wants to dedicate what it really takes to make it, let's say, to championship level in the UFC, and he's still getting paid. So at the end of the day, if that's what is his end goal, he's going to continue to do that and take care of the bottom of the division. So, Prazeres makes some sense there. The over 1.5 is certainly worth a play, in my opinion, as well.
All right, so since there's not a whole lot to talk about here with this Fight Night 145 card, at least not a whole lot to follow up on here the rest of the way, let's take a look ahead real quickly to UFC 235. And when you've got a couple of title fights, odds are out well in advance, obviously with very, very low limits, to say the least. We talked a little bit about market entry and some of your thought processes regarding that. What about these pay-per-view types of cards? I mean, how much are you looking ahead when you've got signature matchups like a Jones versus Smith or a Woodley versus Usman?
Yeah, you really, really got to, it depends on I don't want to say what type of bettor, because every situation is certainly different. But the general rule of thumb, as I've said, is the public wants to do two things. They want to parlay every favorite together and get an even money payout maybe, or they want to bet a little and win a lot. So if you're an underdog bettor, the UFC is a little bit opposite of how you think of most markets, right? Traditionally, if you want to play the underdog, you would wait. If it's NFL or college football, you wait up until the last minute, up until kickoff if you can, to get the best of the number. UFC is a little bit different because public loves to bet the underdog. So a lot of times we saw this with Cain Velasquez. In fact, you got steamed up to like minus 200 and in the final moments before that fight closed. the public loves the underdog in the UFC because they come in so much and anything is certainly possible. I forget what fight it was when it was Derek Lewis and Ngannou, and there was another underdog. The two underdogs won in the main event, and it paid out like 10-1. And instead, I knew a bunch of people who had small bets inside of MGM Sportsbook and couldn't believe their luck. And that's just the type of variance you deal with this sport. So to me, if it's an underdog that I think is either wrong from my lines or I think it's going to be a public side, I will grab it at open. Conversely, if it's a favorite, there's opposite ends of the spectrum, right? There's not going to be a lot of value on John Jones at -900 early or late. It doesn't matter if it opened -970 and you get -8, you know what I mean? It doesn't really matter from that perspective. Just depends on kind of how you handicap that fight and how different is an odds maker's numbers from your own.
Now, I guess the last follow-up point then, numbers of your own. Now, obviously, I don't want you to give away everything. I don't want you to pull the curtain completely back. But, we talk about it in terms of college football, something like that. You've got power ratings. Or we talk about it in terms of basketball, you've got power ratings. So how do you set that up? I mean, do you have power ratings? Or are you just sort of like, going off of what lines have been historically and sort of morphing them to the matchup? How does that work for you?
Yeah, again, I'm a little bit different in that I tend to target round props a lot because styles make fights, and I am perfectly okay being patient and, again, taking a Pudilova over 2.5 at -350 and putting it in, a limit play for and waiting until, the next opportunity. So it really depends. The thing about it is when you're trying to make this, like you said, there's not power rankings because there's not scores. There's not a 6-7, a touchdown is, a takedown is not worth this. And, unless you're doing the DFS side of things. So it's completely different. The way that I do it, again, specifically, I look at stylistically, the least resistance, the least variance. And that to me is, and again, if there was no, in a perfect world, right? If there was no action or there was no variance, what would happen? They would both sit there and the clock would expire, which is why I tend to look for the most boring fights that nobody likes and kind of look at that, in terms of overlines. And specifically, women's fights and kind of specifically targeting round props has been a huge way for me to make money in the UFC. On the other side, when we're talking money lines, when you're handicapping a fight, it's so unique because the way that I do it, in a vacuum. And again, there's so much more that goes into this because fighting is so mental. You have to look at people's social media. What camps are they at? What style is that camp? What is going on in their personal life? Because it is one person out there. It's not as if, Odell Beckham has a bad game because something's going on that someone else can pick him up. There is one-on-one inside a steel cage and they're fighting. So you have to be able to kind of put yourself in their shoes and see that. The way that I do it is I effectively give a grade for each, let's say, technique, whether it be submission defense, striking defense, transition, all these type of things that go into it that I kind of take stock of. And there's a rating and I kind of put that all together and get a raw number and put those up against each other. Like I was talking about with Struve and everything like that. It's a little bit unique in that because obviously when I do that, effectively say I give Struve, let's say it's a 1 to 10 and I give Struve 7s across the board while Santos is a 9 in one and he's a 4 in the other. So obviously Struve is going to come out a little bit heavier looking, when we talk about this from a pure numbers perspective, and that's where everything else comes in. Current form, are they on a win streak? Are they on a losing streak? There's just so much that goes into it post the numbers that's where, kind of, because if you look at raw numbers, they can look really off. You can kind of get yourself in trouble. Like I was talking about, I think that Pudilova line is really built into, the unknown of judging. So much more that goes into handicapping, fighting more than team sports or even tennis and stuff like that's effectively one-on-one, just different. So again, give ratings and kind of go from there when I talk about the mental game.
Christian Pina did a phenomenal job writing up a UFC Fight Night 145 preview over at BangTheBook.com. He'll have a UFC 235 preview next week, and we'll get him back on the show here as well, a little bit more traditional of a segment since I'll hopefully be feeling better next week. But you can follow Christian's work on Twitter at Christian Pina, P-I-N-A, and also check him out on the Gambling Podcast. Christian, appreciate the time as always, man. Thank you so much. Good luck this weekend. Stay warm, and we'll talk to you again next week.
All right. Feel better, buddy. Good luck this weekend.